My Govanen, welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and George R. Martin has kind of been in the news again lately about a crazy thing he said about Lord of the Rings. This quote apparently comes from several years back, but it just recently, for whatever reason, started trending on Twitter. So much so that it even hit my wife's feed, and she doesn't even follow Tolkien related stuff. But it's one of these where it again kind of gives you a really good sense of the difference between George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. And so it's worth exploring. And originally I wasn't going to do this just because the topic is one that I don't want to just talk about. But that's part of the reason why it actually is worth talking about. And my wife kept saying, "You should really talk about this. You should really talk about this." And I'm like, okay, fine. I'll find a way to talk about it. The quote is from some interview he gave a while back, and he basically says this. This is from a website that transcribed it. Basically, it's life is very full of sex, or should be. As much as I admire Tolkien, and I do, he was a giant of fantasy and a giant of literature, and I think he wrote a great book that will be read for many years. You do have to wonder where all those hobbits came from, since you can't imagine hobbits having sex, can you? Well, sex is an important part of who we are. It drives us, it motivates us, it makes us do sometimes very noble things, and it makes us do sometimes incredibly stupid things. Leave it out, and you've got an incomplete world. Now, this is given the way that George R. R. Martin handles the topic of sex, it seems to me that really his interest in it is not really what it seems to be in this quote, because in this quote he's talking about procreation, but that doesn't really ever seem to be the point of his discussion of it in his stories. And I haven't read the books that he's written or anything like that, but I know enough about A Game of Thrones, the television show, and the other stuff from what people have told me and just from the general zeitgeist, because it's all over the place, that you get a pretty decent idea. And there's always something, and I don't know what word encompasses all of it, but something kind of messed up about the way it works in his stories. Like, it's never just a normal, healthy relationship, it doesn't seem. You've got incest, and you've got, other things going on, and abusive relationships. You've got just a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily want to talk about on anything like a family-friendly channel. And you also don't really even want to have it in every story you read. But Martin seems to take the idea that this is a thing that motivates humans and use that as a reason that it needs to be in the story. Well, there's a lot of things that motivate humans that don't need to be in every story. Some people are extremely motivated by greed, and yet, he doesn't complain about the fact that Tolkien doesn't put anybody in The Lord of the Rings whose sole motivating factor or primary motivating factor is just greed. Now, he does do that in The Hobbit, because that's pretty much the dwarves' main, thing, but in The Lord of the Rings, that really isn't the case. And even in The Hobbit, it's kind of a secondary factor compared to the revenge element. Greed becomes a problem, but it's not the main thing throughout the quest. But there are other motivations you could think of that don't appear at all. So some people are motivated by fame. None of the characters in The Lord of the Rings are motivated by fame. They might be motivated by power, but that's a different thing entirely. They might be motivated by other things that are kind of ancillary to fame. But none of them are motivated purely just by being famous. That's nobody's motivation. But that is a normal thing that people are motivated by. There are people who, will go to great lengths to be known because they just want to be known by lots of people. That doesn't mean it has to be in every story. And this is coming to the point where I think Martin is really missing something. And it's not just that he's missing something, but again, like I said, it shows a huge difference between Tolkien and Martin on this topic. Tolkien does not shy away from the issue of sex at all. I mean, he doesn't talk about it in explicit terms, but he doesn't need to. And in fact, the way he kind of usually skirts around it gives more oomph to the times where he really kind of gets closer to it. And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit, but you could probably already guess what it is. But the main thing that I want to point out here is it doesn't need to be in the forefront of everything. I mean, Martin says in the quote that it's a big part of life, or should be. It's like, well, yeah, but trips to the toilet are a big part of life. We make many of them every day. We do it more often than we have sex. But do we want to talk about it every time we write a story? Like, and yeah, it's not a big motivating factor, and I can't take credit for that quip either, because somebody else had made the point on Twitter, around the same time that I saw this quote floating around. But the point is, it's like, just because it's a big part of life doesn't mean it has to be thrust into our face. Tolkien clearly did recognize that it was a big part of life. Sam has a bunch of kids. Like, this is, and we know how they happen. We also know how orcs get made. And I don't mean made, if you know what I mean. And that's not even the example that I was talking about, but that is actually a great example of how his not talking about it all the time makes it more impactful when you actually think about the implications of things. Because the way orcs reproduce, and especially in certain contexts, like Saruman's building an army from orc men, goblin men, and half orcs, or however it's termed, when you stop and actually think about what that means, it's not a pleasant thought, but it's more unpleasant precisely because we don't already have a rampant amount of, what you might call inappropriate sex going on all the time anyway. When you're not already seeing that, and then you know about this one instance that's like, whoa, it makes it that much more powerful to think about how bad it is. Whereas in George R.R. Martin's stories, it's like, how low would you have to sink before it became shocking again? It's just like, it's all bad all the time. And another point here is, I think this quote really tells us more about Martin's own, I don't know what I want to call it, but his own perspective, let's say, on things, than it does about anything else. Because it's like, if you're that eaten up with the idea of this one topic, it really is more about you and your maybe abnormal interests than about how storytelling ought to be done. Like, I mean, there are tons of stories out there where you don't have sex as an explicit primary motive. It's true. Now, don't get me wrong, love stories always kind of have implicitly that as the motive. And if you read the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, we know that that is in fact kind of Aragorn's primary motive. It's actually the reason why he is the man he is, because at the age of 20, when he finds out his true identity, he also meets Arwen by chance, seemingly, as, a chance meeting, as we call it in Middle-earth, and pretty much instantly falls in love, because she's literally the most beautiful thing on the planet, except maybe Galadriel, have Éomer and Gimli give you the finer points of that argument. But the point being, his primary reason for trying to become the great man that he is in The Lord of the Rings, and ultimately regain the kingship of Gondor and Arnor, is because Elrond tells him, yeah, you ain't marrying my daughter unless you become king of Gondor and Arnor. She's not giving up her immortality for anything less than that. So, yeah, you better get to work. So, like, literally, that is his primary motivation. I mean, that is it. But it doesn't have to be put in the crude terms of, he wants to get in bed with her. he sees her, she's really beautiful, he falls in love, and you can leave the rest of it, like, in the background. It doesn't have to be stated. And this seems to be the difference between Martin and Tolkien. Martin seems to think that we just have to really be about the actual act itself. Like, if you don't talk about that, you're missing something. Well, no, because yes, sex is a normal part of life, but Tolkien recognizes because it's normal, it doesn't have to be this thing that we have to talk about and really explore in great depth all the time. For the same reason that we don't have to explore toilet breaks. Like, it's just, for Tolkien, you can leave a lot of that in the background because we all know that it is a thing. You don't have to bring it to people's attention because we already know it. Martin brings it to our attention for reasons I won't, speculate about. But you have to wonder if it's just because he has an abnormal and perhaps unhealthy interest in the topic. So let me go to the example that I wanted to bring up, and like I said, you could probably guess this, but it's Turin, right? Turin ends up marrying his own sister, unknowingly, of course, but the difference is, because we don't know that much about the sex lives of Tolkien's characters, and we don't get lots of explicit references. In fact, we never get an explicit reference to them, doing the deed, although we do learn that Nienor is pregnant by the time she dies. Because we don't, see this everywhere we, look, we just know that people love each other, get married, and have kids. That actually makes what Turin and Nienor do all the more shocking. And it gives us the huge, emotional response that, Nienor has when she learns of it, because Glaurung basically tells her and then, lifts the spell of her forgetfulness, and she realizes what she's done. But can you imagine this being a huge shock in a George R.R. Martin story where you've already got Jaime Lannister and Cersei Lannister, doing that just for fun all the time? You can't, because George R.R. Martin has made the topic so prominent that it's not really anything that you could get shocked about anymore. It's a lot easier for you to be shocked when, as Tolkien does, you just, you point out, this guy loves this girl loves this guy back, they end up getting together and they have babies. It's like, we all know how that works. We don't need a play-by-play, guys. We know how that works. That's all we need to know for purposes of the story and even for purposes of motivation. But then, when you get the story of Turin and he marries his sister, you're like, oh, that wasn't good, and it's a big thing precisely because we're not making a big deal out of, abnormal activity all the time, which seems to be what Martin does. Is there, I don't actually want you to tell me, but I mean, it's a rhetorical question. It's like, is there even an example of a normal, healthy relationship in Martin that gets talked about in the way that all the other ones do? I doubt it. And even if there is, the point remains, even if you talk about the normal, healthy ones in detail in the way that you would the other ones, it's like you still have filled up so much of the world with this one thing that you've taken away any real sense of it being unusual or inappropriate or impactful in any way. I don't have to know exactly what, two characters are going to do on their wedding night to understand that when Tuor comes to Gondolin and sees Idril Celebrimbor, he looks at her and falls in love, and then, as a result of that, he wants to become a man that she would marry and get, good enough that her father would let him marry her. Why do we need to go further than that? I mean, there's really no reason. So this whole idea that Martin is like, we have to have it, all over the place in the world and explain motivations and all this other stuff, It's like, have you actually ever read anything where you didn't have to be told almost explicitly everything up front for you to get it? Like, it just betrays such a weird way of thinking about the world. And it's kind of like Aragorn's tax policy. And I know it was like a, kind of half joking remark on Martin's part, but this whole idea that we have to know these details, it's like, no, we don't. We don't have to know everything about everybody to understand their motivations. We don't have to, explore every minute detail. We only need broad brushstrokes. And it's, a lot of stuff can be just kind of implied. We don't need it to be explicit because we're all humans and we're talking about humans in the story. Even the elves are effectively just humans. They're just with different types of, attributes that make them different, but they have the same kinds of motivations for the most part. So ultimately, it's like, why do we have to have it stated and put out there in front? We really don't. The only reason why you would is for reasons other than what Martin claims are the reasons that he thinks Tolkien was, missing something. And again, this whole idea, it's like, can you imagine hobbits having sex? Well, maybe I don't want to. Like, that's not the point of the story. And if it's the idea of imagining it that you think is missing from Tolkien, you're interested in a very different kind of story than what Tolkien is trying to tell. That doesn't mean that Tolkien's stories are lacking. It just means that you're not interested in that kind of story. And that's fine. Tolkien probably would have said something like he said about a whole bunch of other authors. He said, all these people didn't like my book, which is fine, because I don't like theirs either. It's like, if that's what you're interested in, go to a different kind of store, okay? That's not what Tolkien is writing about, because it's not the thing he's interested in telling. It's the same reason he's not interested in finishing The New Shadow. He didn't want to write a thriller story. He probably wouldn't have wanted to write a detective novel either. I mean, he wanted to write a certain kind of story, a fairy story. And fairy stories for Tolkien means not something that has to involve a bunch of sex all over the place. This doesn't seem like a complicated topic to me, but apparently George R.R. Martin finds it really hard, and I don't know. And again, I haven't watched the interview where he made this comment, and this one may have been half joking too. But the fact remains, even if he was telling it half in a joking way, it still points out something about the difference in framework. Martin seems to think that you have to have things laid out, for the reader that Tolkien doesn't, because Tolkien is writing just a different kind of story. He's not writing the kind of story where we have to have, those kinds of things put in our faces as, look, here's somebody's motivation. It's like we can figure that out from other things. Aragorn and Arwen, even if you don't read the appendices, we get the fact pretty early on that Aragorn is interested in Arwen, because Bilbo kind of nudge, nudge, winks, winks him and says, Arwen was at the dinner. You can't miss that if you're old enough. And, that reference is kind of obvious. And then, of course, at the end of the story, when everybody's just kind of waiting around Minas Tirith, and Frodo's like, probably need to get going home soon. And Gandalf's like, wait a minute, we got one more thing coming, just hang on. And then Arwen arrives, and they get married, and Frodo understands, oh, yeah, okay. It's like, we all get it. We know what's going to happen next. We know, it's not complicated. And then, of course, they all go back to the Shire, and Sam gets married with Rosie, and they have more than a dozen kids. How do you think that happens? We don't need to have it explained to us. We don't need to have it as a scene in the story. We don't need to have any of that, precisely because life is full of it, and it is a normal part of life. life doesn't exist without sex. And so we don't have to have it be a part of every story, because the point of the story is to tell us things that are interesting and not in the ordinary. And Tolkien, being the, good conservative Catholic that he was, would have thought of sex as just the thing that you do with your spouse and have kids. It's not, the kinds of things that happen in Martin's world would have been so abhorrent to Tolkien that the only instances you get of things like that are kind of vague references to how orcs come into being, and, stuff like the Turin story where you do get an incestuous relationship by accident, and it's like, oh, wow, that's horrifying. That for Tolkien, it is precisely because it's normal that we don't need to talk about it, except when it's kind of a big deal, and then we don't even need to barely do anything other than mention it to get the reader to go, yeah, that's not comfortable. Because it's just normal. It's like any other normal part of life that can get twisted and taken out of its normal context. You don't need to talk about it, but you might need to talk about it when it becomes a problem. And that seems to be the issue with Martin, is like, when he talks about it, it's always a problem, and there's a lot of problems in Westeros. But for Tolkien, because it's just a normal, healthy thing that people do, we don't need to talk about it, because it's not something that's so out of the way that we need to bring it up and be like, oh man, look at that thing they did. It's like, it's a thing people do. Most all people do. You might find a few people in your life, very few, that just have never done it with anybody. Those people exist. They're rare, but, the vast majority of people do it at some point, because that's the way humans are wired. We're just kind of built to do that. Just like most, animals or anything else that reproduces sexually. It's just normal. It's a part of life. We don't need to twist it out of its shape and bring it to everybody's attention for it to be a thing that we understand as a motive for human action or any other kind of species character's action, right? It's just, we know that Sam loves Rosie. It only really comes up kind of late in the story, but once we know it, it's like, okay, he loves Rosie. We know what that means if we're of a certain age, and we know what's going to happen next. And sure enough, it happens a lot, apparently. But why does it need to be a thing that we talk about? It really doesn't. And that's the difference between Tolkien and Martin, not just in their approach to the topic of sex, but in the approach to the topic of storytelling. Like, for Tolkien, because it's a normal thing, we don't need to talk about it. We all know about it. It's there, and we can tell it's there. And that's all we really need. That's as far as it needs to go. Unless we have, the odd story like, Turin and his sister getting married. And then it's like, And even then, you don't have to be explicit about it. It's just, you just have to recognize that the two of them got married, and we know what came next after that. So it's just, why Martin says these things, I don't know. Does he really think he's saying something that's interesting or informative, or does he realize how much he's telling everybody about himself? Like, I just don't understand it. But this is why I'll never read his stories, by the way, because ultimately what I am the kind of story I am interested in is the one that Tolkien tells. I like his kind of story. I don't particularly like George R.R. Martin's type of story. And therefore, Martin, you can take your ideas and shove them. I don't care. I'd just rather not. So, this is not a topic I was really interested in talking about at all, but it, kind of blew up on Twitter, and I'm kind of late getting to it even at that. But, it is at least worth examining what kind of differences are the two men, in their storytelling styles, their, the things they kind of focus on. And again, it's worth noting that Martin's line doesn't make even any sense in his own terms. Like, you can't write about every human motivation in a story, even one as big as, the Song of Ice and Fire. As long as that is, you can't cover every possible human motivation in all of that because there's just so many of them. Humans are complex. We have so many motivations. And sometimes they're mixed motivations at that. I mean, you can't do everything. And so to act like Tolkien is somehow lacking because he left this one out, Tolkien wasn't writing that story. And if you don't, like, just get over it. If you don't want to read that kind of story, don't read that kind of story. But that's the funny thing. He says he really admires Tolkien and he likes it. It's like, then maybe you just don't understand why it works and why other things work. It's like, just because you think it would be made better by this doesn't mean it would. Maybe you should, like, just take a step back and go, I don't have to put that in every story. And I don't have to make a big deal out of everything that, fits this category of a thing that's normal in life that gives a lot of motivation to people. Because that's so many things. Maybe some of this can just be background because it's not important to the story I want to tell. It's really simple. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. So I've kind of belabored the point, but it's, it just drives me nutty when Martin says stuff like this. So you get me started and I just get on a roll. But anyway, if you, have any comments on this, I guess leave them in the comments section. I don't really necessarily want to get too deep into the topic for obvious reasons, but at least it might be worth talking about kind of the underlying basic stuff about how you go about telling stories and all that kind of stuff. But if you enjoyed the video and me just ranting and raving, give me a thumbs up. Maybe give me a thumbs down if you think I should avoid this kind of approach to videos. But like I said, I wasn't really keen on doing it in the first place anyway, so it won't hurt my feelings. And then if you're interested, also make sure you follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter for Tolkien-related trivia questions. Check out the other support and social links in the description below. And until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.